The Vietnam War was America's longest war until the recent war in Afghanistan. It was a strange war by many measures. It was a war in which the U.S. won every battle but lost the war. Uh, the background of this is very important. Um, First of all, let's talk about traditions that the Vietnamese people have. Uh, they are very hostile to invaders. They spent centuries repelling Chinese invaders, but they're hostile to any invaders. They have also been hostile to any central government, whether run by the Chinese or the Vietnamese or the French or indirectly by the Americans. They're hostile also to colonizers, foreign nations that come in to exploit Vietnamese resources and the Vietnamese people for their own purposes. Along with this hostility to outsiders is the fact that the basic unit in Vietnam is the village. They don't think in terms of the nation, they think in terms of their own local village. So you can see, given this background, that when the French came in the late 19th century, they were seen as enemies. Uh, this will give you an idea of the areas that the French controlled from the 1860s to the beginning in the 1860s up to the 1890s, and they would continue to control this area until the 1950s. The countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia combined made up what the French called Indochina. And this was all one French colony, even though there are three different cultures involved here. Now, in French Indochina, cash crops, especially rubber, were very important, and they tended to overwhelm subsistence agriculture. Subsistence means you farm things only for your own use and not for a global market. Growing rice, for example, for you and the people who live very near to you. But when land is taken over for these large plantations, that has a terrible effect on this kind of small-scale agriculture. And in the process, that weakened what was most precious to the Vietnamese, their village structure, and along with it created shortages of food and brought malnutrition. Now, in World War II, uh, the French were ousted by the Japanese. France itself, of course, fell to the Germans. It lost its independence, and the Germans allies, the Japanese, moved into Indochina in World War II. The French, as a result, lost face. That means they were terribly embarrassed uh, uh, by their defeat at the hands of the Japanese. But when Japan was defeated in 1945, the French returned and expected to be able to continue business as usual now that the Japanese were out of the picture. Uh, Others in Vietnam, though, had a very different idea about that. The Vietnamese communists were called the Viet Men. They opposed the French, uh, but they became equated with nationalism, which was gaining strength in the eyes of villagers. That means defending local traditions against foreign invaders. These Viet Minh rebelled against the Japanese in 1945 and were centered in the northern city of Hanoi. Their leader was Ho Chi Minh. Um, he was a Viet Minh, as I said. Now, was he primarily a nationalist, somebody who wanted to expel foreign invaders or occupiers or colonizers? Or was he primarily a communist? Well, the answer is he was both. But the United States tended to assume that if anyone was a communist, that's all they were, and that all communists were alike. And that was not, however, accurate. The French fought the Viet Men for several years, uh, and everyone assumed, now I shouldn't say everyone, but people in the West, Western Europe and North America, assumed that the French, as a modern industrialized country, would triumph in this war. They did not. And the key battle was way up in the north of Vietnam, in the northwest, in an isolated mountainous region around Dien Bien Phu. The key battle happened in 1954. The French were having great difficulty fighting a guerrilla war, a war in which the enemy could not be found, could not be identified, used hit and run tactics. So the French sent 11,000 troops deep into enemy territory and really were daring the Viet Minh to fight, thinking if we can get them out onto an open battlefield, we can defeat them. Uh, but it worked exactly the other way around. The Viet Minh, with some Chinese help, actually using sheer muscle power, took artillery up into the mountains and were able to fire down on the French who were in this valley that you see in the photo. And the world was stunned at the French defeat. They had asked President Eisenhower for air support. Eisenhower was skeptical of the French prospects there and refused U.S. air support. After that defeat, France had little choice but to reach some sort of peace agreement. This was done in Geneva, Switzerland, in 1954. And as a result of this, there was a ceasefire. The French are basically out. Uh, and there was the country was divided into two parts. You can see in the yellow here in the south is South Vietnam, and in the north, in the purple, is North Vietnam. And in between the two, there was a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, at the 17th parallel. There would be free elections according to this agreement, there would be free elections to unify the country in 2 years, and then the French would be completely out. They were essentially out after Dien Bien Phu anyway. Now, it's important to realize that North and South Vietnam were not ever intended to be permanent countries. They were set up as a temporary division until the country could be reunified. Now, the Eisenhower administration supported the president of South Vietnam, a man by the name of Diem. He was a Catholic in a country where Catholics were not a majority. The greater numbers were Buddhists. Catholics were identified with the hated French as well. And Diem, after 2 years in 1956, refused to hold those elections that were promised, and the United States supported him because it was almost inevitable that Ho Chi Minh, the northern communist, would win if those elections, fair elections, were held. And there are officials from the Eisenhower administration that admit after the fact that the U.S. Really did not favor seeing those elections happen at all. Eisenhower, or Ike, was motivated by something called the domino theory. If Vietnam fell, then Laos would fall, Cambodia would fall, maybe Burma, maybe Malaysia, and then one domino would knock over the next, and all of Southeast Asia would be lost to the communists. This, of course, fits with the idea of containment, that you don't allow the communists to gain another inch of territory. About this time, a group began operating inside South Vietnam. They were called the Viet Cong. They were separate from the North Vietnamese army. These were Southerners who were conducting a guerrilla war against the government of Diem, the government of the South. In 1961, John Kennedy became President of the United States, And he, like Eisenhower, feared that Laos and Cambodia would be dominoes, that if Vietnam fell, they would fall as well. So he brought in some advisors, Green Berets, uh, that were intended to help the South Vietnamese defend themselves more effectively. At first, there were about 600, and the goal was to win what a common phrase at the time was to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. But the number of advisors increased during the Kennedy administration to about 16,000 by the time of his assassination in November 1963. It's a lot of advice, and it was inevitable that as these military advisors were working with the South Vietnamese military, that if the South Vietnamese or they came under fire, they would pick up their weapons and fire back. So little by little, the United States got involved in a combat role in Vietnam. President Diem was a difficult ally for the United States to put up with. There were poor farmers there who had real grievances, real problems, and Diem, from an elite background, refused to address those problems. He seemed to almost go out of his way to alienate Buddhists, prohibiting them from flying their flag, their religious symbol. It was also a very corrupt regime. His cronies, his relatives, profited enormously, while the majority of the Vietnamese people did very badly. The U.S. CIA decided that Diem had to go. And they let that be known to people in the South Vietnamese army. They did not know or anticipate that the army would then kill Diem, but that's what they did on November 2nd, 1963. Also that year, there was a Buddhist monk, there are actually several Buddhist monks, who gained worldwide attention by burning themselves in public in protest against the policies of the South Vietnamese government. And this brought a great deal of attention to the deficiencies, the shortcomings of the Diem regime. Now, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, only about 3 weeks after Diem had died. And there is debate right down to the present day over what his policies would have been had he lived. We know that 2 days before he was killed, he asked for a complete review of the Vietnam situation. But advisors disagree about what he would have done. Would he have withdrawn? Would he have escalated or increased the involvement of the United States? We don't know that for sure. The successor to President Kennedy was President Lyndon Johnson, and he is associated with the huge escalation or buildup of the U.S. effort in Vietnam. And that shows up especially with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. In August 1964, there were 2 incidents in which in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, U.S. ships were fired upon, or maybe one was fired upon. We're not sure about that. It was very flimsy evidence. But Johnson, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, asked Congress for a resolution approving a military response, and Congress overwhelmingly approved that. This was pretty much giving Johnson a blank check to do whatever he wanted to do. Now, interesting thing though, the text of this resolution was written even before the Gulf of Tonkin incident had taken place. So that certainly might lead us to believe that this is something that Johnson wanted, that he expected. Uh, After that, uh, Johnson rapidly escalated the war. In February of 65, he initiated Operation Rolling Thunder when the U.S. began a massive bombing campaign of North Vietnam. Uh, but how do you bomb footbridges and trails and tunnels in the jungle? An awful lot of bombs were dropped, more on Vietnam than in the entire, in all of World War II, by all sides in World War II. And some American planes were shot down by Russian SAM missiles, surface-to-air missiles. Um, so what seemed to be a mismatch turned into a long and delayed war. We're going to stop here. We'll continue after this with part two.